November 24, 1971. It began as one of the most ordinary flights imaginable. On a cloudy afternoon in the United States, a Northwest Orient Airlines flight prepared to leave Portland, Oregon, for Seattle, Washington. The route was so short that most passengers expected to be in Seattle within half an hour. There were only 36 passengers on board, along with 6 crew members. Nothing about the flight appeared unusual. People settled into their seats, some reading newspapers, others staring out the windows. Business travelers were eager to reach their destination. Families chatted quietly. Flight attendants moved through the cabin carrying out their routine duties. Among all those passengers sat a man who attracted almost no attention. He looked like someone you might pass every day without remembering. He wore a dark business suit, a white dress shirt, and a black tie. His appearance was neat, professional, and completely unremarkable. Witnesses later estimated that he was in his mid-40s. Calm and composed, he carried a briefcase and took a seat near the rear of the aircraft. Seat 18E. At first glance, he seemed like any other businessman traveling between two nearby cities. But appearances can be deceiving. As the aircraft climbed into the sky, this quiet passenger ordered a drink and remained relaxed that he wasn't nervous. He wasn't acting suspiciously. In fact, if someone had been asked to identify the least likely person to cause trouble on board, many might have pointed directly at him. Yet behind that calm expression was a plan that would soon make aviation history. Shortly after takeoff, the man called over one of the flight attendants. Her name was Florence Schaffner, a young crew member who had likely dealt with hundreds of passengers before. To her, this interaction seemed completely routine. The passenger politely introduced himself. "My name is Dan Cooper," he said. Then he handed her a folded note. At first, Schaffner didn't think much of it. Attractive flight attendants often received phone numbers, invitations, and handwritten messages from passengers. Assuming it was something similar, she casually slipped the note into her pocket without even reading it. The man watched her for a moment. Then he leaned closer. His voice remained calm. There was no panic, no anger, no raised tone. But what he said next instantly changed everything. "Miss, you'd better read that note." Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. What Florence Schaffner was about to discover would transform a routine 30-minute flight into one of the most baffling criminal cases in American history. And once she unfolded that piece of paper, there would be no turning back. Inside that note was a message so shocking that it forced the crew into a secret crisis. While dozens of passengers sat peacefully in their seats, completely unaware of the danger around them, a mysterious man had just revealed a threat that could change all of their lives in an instant. For a few moments, Florence Schaffner simply stared at the folded piece of paper in her hands. The passenger who had given it to her didn't appear dangerous. He wasn't shouting, making threats, or drawing attention to himself. In fact, he looked more composed than anyone else on the aircraft, but when he told her to read the note, something in his voice made her realize this was no joke. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. The message was brief, direct, and terrifying. It informed her that the man sitting beside her had a bomb in his briefcase and wanted her to sit next to him immediately. At first, Schaffner struggled to believe what she was reading. The claim seemed impossible. The man looked far too calm to be carrying out a hijacking. Yet there was something about his confidence that made her hesitate. Without creating panic among the passengers, she quietly moved to the seat beside him. The mysterious passenger remained perfectly relaxed. Then, sensing her doubt, he decided to prove he wasn't bluffing. He carefully opened his briefcase just enough for her to see inside. What she saw instantly erased any uncertainty. Inside were several red cylindrical objects connected by wires, along with what appeared to be a large battery. Whether the device was fully functional or not, it looked convincing enough to leave no room for argument. At that moment, Schaffner realized she was dealing with a man who had planned every detail. The passenger calmly explained what he wanted. He demanded $200,000 in cash, not tomorrow, not next week. He wanted the money delivered before the aircraft landed, but that wasn't all. Along with the cash, he requested 4 parachutes, 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. In addition, he wanted a fuel truck ready when the aircraft reached Seattle. Every demand was delivered in a measured tone. He never raised his voice. He never appeared nervous. It was as if he were discussing business arrangements rather than carrying out a hijacking. Then came the warning. If anyone attempted anything clever, if authorities tried to trick him, or if the crew failed to cooperate, the consequences could be disastrous for everyone on board. Meanwhile, the passengers remained completely unaware. Some were reading magazines. Others were chatting quietly. A few were probably wondering why the flight attendant seemed slightly more serious than before. None of them knew that a life-or-death negotiation had already begun just a few rows away. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Schaffner carefully left Cooper's side and headed toward the cockpit. There, she informed the pilots about the note and the bomb threat. Within minutes, another flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, was brought into the situation. Together, the crew began acting as messengers between the cockpit and the hijacker. What started as a routine flight had now become a hostage crisis thousands of feet above the ground. But the most surprising part of the story wasn't Cooper's demands. It was the response he would receive. As news of the hijacking reached airline executives and federal authorities, a decision was made that shocked many investigators later. Instead of challenging the hijacker, they were about to give him exactly what he wanted, and that decision would change the course of the mystery forever. As the pilots received word of the hijacker demands, the situation quickly escalated beyond the aircraft itself. Messages were relayed from the cockpit to air traffic control. From there, the information moved rapidly through airline management and eventually reached the highest levels of decision-making within Northwest Orient Airlines. A major crisis was unfolding in the sky. The man calling himself Dan Cooper had demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueling truck waiting upon landing. More importantly, he claimed to have a bomb on board. At that moment, the airline faced an impossible choice. Should they resist? Should they attempt to outsmart him, or should they cooperate? After consultations with federal authorities and company officials, an unexpected decision was made. The airline would comply, every demand. No negotiations. No delays. No risks. The reasoning behind this decision was simple. There were dozens of innocent lives aboard the aircraft. Any attempt to provoke the hijacker could have ended in disaster. Beyond the immediate safety concerns, company executives also feared the consequences of a highly publicized tragedy. If something went wrong, the damage to the airline's reputation could be devastating. So while Cooper sat calmly in his seat, arrangements began on the ground. The FBI became involved. A bank in Seattle was contacted. Officials rushed to gather the required money before the plane arrived. Interestingly, the cash prepared for Cooper wasn't ordinary cash. Investigators took a precaution that would become incredibly important later in the story. Every bill was carefully documented before being handed over. At the time, nobody knew how valuable that decision would prove to be. Meanwhile, another problem emerged. The flight from Portland to Seattle was supposed to take only around 30 minutes. The authorities needed much more time than that. To solve the problem, the pilots came up with a believable excuse. Instead of landing immediately, the aircraft would continue circling near Seattle while officials prepared everything below. From the passenger's perspective, nothing seemed unusual. The captain announced that minor technical issues were causing a delay. Nobody panicked. Nobody suspected a hijacking. Hour after hour, the aircraft remained in the air. A short regional flight slowly transformed into a tense airborne waiting game. Throughout the ordeal, Cooper remained surprisingly calm. He drank his beverages, spoke politely with the crew, and carefully monitored the progress of his demands. Witnesses later recalled that he rarely showed signs of anger or impatience. It was as though he knew exactly how events would unfold. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of waiting, the plane received clearance to land in Seattle. As evening approached, the aircraft touched down safely. But Cooper wasn't finished. Following his instructions, the plane was parked far away from the airport terminal, isolated from other aircraft and passengers. Soon, a representative approached carrying the ransom money and the parachutes. Everything the hijacker had requested was finally within reach. The authorities had done exactly what he asked. Yet nobody realized that the most dangerous phase of the operation was only beginning. With the cash now in his possession and 4 parachutes at his feet, Cooper suddenly made a move that shocked everyone involved. Instead of ending the hijacking, he released almost everyone on board, and revealed the next stage of a plan that seemed straight out of a Hollywood thriller. As the aircraft sat isolated on the runway in Seattle, the tense standoff finally appeared to be reaching its conclusion. The mysterious hijacker had received exactly what he demanded. The bag containing $200,000 in cash was now on board. The 4 parachutes had also been delivered. At this point, many people likely assumed Cooper would surrender or negotiate a safe escape route. After all, he already had the money. The passengers had been released unharmed. The crisis seemed close to ending. But Cooper had something entirely different in mind. Once he confirmed that the ransom and parachutes were aboard, he allowed all 36 passengers to leave the aircraft. Most of them stepped onto the runway without ever realizing how close they had come to danger. Several crew members were also released. Only a small group remained. The pilots. The flight engineer. Co-pilot Bill Radijak. And flight attendant Tina Mucklow. With the passengers gone, the atmosphere inside the aircraft changed immediately. What had been a crowded commercial flight now felt strangely empty. Yet Cooper's plan was only entering its most important phase. After the aircraft was refueled, he ordered the crew to take off once again. His destination? Mexico City. However, the instructions he gave next left the pilots puzzled. Cooper wasn't merely choosing a destination. He was dictating exactly how the aircraft should be flown. He instructed the pilots to maintain a relatively low altitude of around 10,000 feet. He wanted the plane traveling as slowly as possible while remaining airborne. He also specified the wing flap settings and other technical details that suggested he possessed an unusual understanding of aircraft operations. The crew found this surprising. Most passengers wouldn't know these details. Even many frequent flyers wouldn't understand them. Yet Cooper spoke as if he had studied the aircraft beforehand. The pilots warned him that reaching Mexico City under those conditions would be difficult because the aircraft lacked sufficient fuel. Cooper didn't seem concerned. He simply repeated his instructions. For him, Mexico City may never have been the true objective. As darkness settled over the Pacific Northwest, rain and storm clouds covered much of the region below. Visibility outside was poor. The conditions were far from ideal. Yet Cooper appeared completely committed to whatever came next. Then, shortly after takeoff, he issued another order. He told Tina Mucklow to enter the cockpit. Once inside, she was instructed to close the door and remain there. For the first time since the hijacking began, Cooper was completely alone in the passenger cabin. Nobody could see what he was doing. Nobody could monitor his movements. Inside the cockpit, the crew could only follow his instructions and wait. Minutes passed. Then a warning light suddenly illuminated on the flight deck. The indicator showed that the aircraft's rear staircase had been deployed. This was a unique feature of the Boeing 727, a staircase built into the tail section that could be lowered during flight. The crew immediately realized what was happening. Cooper was preparing to leave the plane. Somewhere outside, in freezing temperatures, strong winds, heavy rain, and complete darkness, he was standing near an open stairway with a parachute and a bag containing $200,000. Then, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft suddenly lurched. The tail section shifted noticeably, forcing the pilots to stabilize the plane. Something significant had just happened. But nobody inside the cockpit saw it. And that moment would become the heart of one of history's greatest mysteries. When the plane finally landed hours later, investigators rushed on board expecting to find clues. Instead, they discovered something far stranger. Cooper was gone. The money was gone. The parachutes were gone. And the only evidence he left behind would raise more questions than answers. Hours after the mysterious hijacker disappeared into the night, the Boeing 727 finally touched down in Reno, Nevada. Law enforcement officers, FBI agents, and airport personnel were already waiting. Everyone expected answers. Surely there would be evidence. Surely there would be some clue pointing toward where the hijacker had gone. After all, a man had just jumped from a moving aircraft carrying $200,000 in cash. How far could he have gotten? The moment the plane came to a stop, investigators rushed on board and began searching every corner of the aircraft. What they found was both encouraging and frustrating. The hijacker was gone, completely gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. No sign of the money. No sign of the parachutes. No sign of the briefcase that supposedly contained a bomb. It was as if the man had simply disappeared into thin air. Still, the search wasn't entirely unsuccessful. Scattered throughout the aircraft were a few items Cooper had left behind. One of the most important pieces of evidence was a black clip-on tie. Nearby, investigators also found the tie clip that had been attached to it. At the time, these items seemed relatively insignificant. Nobody could have guessed that decades later, they would become some of the most valuable clues in the entire case. Agents also recovered several cigarette butts believed to have been smoked by Cooper during the flight. Since smoking was permitted on commercial aircraft in those days, this wasn't unusual. Unfortunately, those cigarette butts would later be lost before modern DNA testing could be performed on them. It was a devastating setback for investigators. As the examination continued, specialists dusted surfaces throughout the cabin for fingerprints. The results were surprising. Investigators discovered dozens of unidentified fingerprints inside the aircraft. In total, around 66 prints could not immediately be matched to crew members or passengers. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the FBI had a promising lead, but once again, the mystery deepened. No confirmed suspect could be connected to the prints. No immediate identification was possible. Meanwhile, another question haunted investigators. Did Cooper even survive? The conditions outside the aircraft had been horrific. It was nighttime. Heavy rain covered the region, strong winds battered the aircraft. The ground below consisted of dense forests, steep terrain, rivers, and remote wilderness. Most experts initially believed survival was extremely unlikely. Many assumed the FBI would eventually discover a body somewhere in the vast forests of Washington state. Yet days passed, then weeks, then months. Nothing was found. No body. No parachute. No money. No confirmed sighting. As the search expanded, what began as a hijacking investigation slowly transformed into something much bigger. It became a mystery that would challenge thousands of investigators, generate hundreds of theories, and remain unsolved for decades. The FBI officially launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. The operation would continue for an astonishing 45 years, yet even after all that time, the agency would still struggle to answer the most important question of all. Who exactly was the man known as D.B. Cooper? As investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered two strange details that made this hijacking unlike any other in history. One involved a calm flight attendant who may have prevented a disaster. The other involved a simple mistake that accidentally created the legendary name D.B. Cooper, a name that wasn't even the hijacker real alias. The name that never existed. As the FBI's investigation gained momentum, agents quickly realized that this wasn't a typical hijacking case. Most hijackings ended with arrests, shootouts, negotiations, or at the very least, clear evidence. But the Cooper case seemed different from the very beginning. In fact, there were two details that made this incident unlike almost anything investigators had ever seen before. The first involved the remarkable behavior of the flight crew. Throughout the entire hijacking, not a single passenger on board realized what was happening. Think about that for a moment. A man had threatened to blow up an aircraft. He had demanded a fortune in cash and multiple parachutes. Yet dozens of people sat peacefully in their seats without the slightest clue that their lives were potentially at risk. Many people later credited this outcome to flight attendant Tina Mucklow. When Florence Schaffner first alerted the crew, Tina became the primary point of contact between Cooper and the cockpit. Throughout the ordeal, she remained calm, professional, and composed. She never allowed panic to spread through the cabin. She carefully relayed information, followed instructions, and helped ensure that Cooper remained cooperative. Years later, members of the flight crew would speak highly of her role during the crisis. Some even believed her calm demeanor prevented the situation from spiraling out of control. Had panic erupted among the passengers, the outcome might have been very different. But there was another fascinating aspect of the case. The name itself. Today, almost everyone knows the mystery as the case of D.B. Cooper. Books use that name. Documentaries use that name. News reports use that name. Yet there is one major problem. The hijacker never actually called himself D.B. Cooper. When he boarded the flight, he introduced himself as Dan Cooper. So how did Dan Cooper become D.B. Cooper? The answer lies in a simple mistake. As news of the hijacking spread, journalists rushed to publish details before competitors could. One reporter, working under intense deadline pressure, reportedly misunderstood information received from a source. Instead of hearing Dan Cooper, he interpreted the name as D.B. Cooper. The incorrect name appeared in a news report. Then another reporter repeated it. And another. Within hours, newspapers across the country were using the wrong name. Before long, the public had accepted it as fact. The strange part is that even after authorities clarified the mistake, it didn't matter. The public had already anchored itself to the first version of the story. The nickname D.B. Cooper stuck permanently. Ironically, the world's most famous unidentified hijacker became known by a name he never actually used. But while reporters debated names and the public became fascinated with the mystery, FBI investigators were focusing on something far more important. The conditions of Cooper's jump. Because if they could determine whether he survived the fall, they might finally know whether they were hunting a living fugitive, or searching for a body hidden somewhere deep in the wilderness. And the evidence they uncovered painted a terrifying picture. The more investigators analyzed Cooper's jump, the more impossible it seemed. Freezing temperatures, violent winds, heavy rain, dense forests, and complete darkness stood between him and survival. Most experts believed no one could have lived through it. But a series of later hijackings would force the FBI to reconsider everything they thought they knew. As the FBI continued examining every detail of the hijacking, one question overshadowed all the others. Did Cooper survive the jump? At first, investigators believed the answer was obvious. No, the conditions were simply too extreme. According to the FBI's estimates, Cooper had leaped from a Boeing 727 at roughly 10,000 feet above the ground. It was around 8 p.m., meaning the entire region below was covered in darkness. Rainstorms were moving through the area, visibility was poor, and powerful winds were sweeping across the Pacific Northwest. Even experienced skydivers would have considered such conditions dangerous, but Cooper faced even greater challenges. When he jumped, he was wearing ordinary business clothes, a suit, dress shirt, loafers, and a thin overcoat. He wasn't dressed for a wilderness landing. He wasn't carrying survival equipment. He wasn't equipped for freezing temperatures. Then there was the money. Investigators believed Cooper had attached the ransom money to himself before leaving the aircraft. The cash weighed approximately 10 kilograms, adding extra weight and making a safe landing even more difficult. If he landed in a forest, he could have been injured. If he landed on rocky terrain, he could have been killed instantly, and if he landed in water, his chances looked even worse. The lakes and rivers in that region become extremely cold during November. Experts warned that if Cooper had fallen into one of those waters, hypothermia could have set in within minutes. Combined with the weight of the money, swimming to safety would have been nearly impossible. Because of all these factors, many investigators initially concluded that Cooper probably died shortly after jumping, case closed. Or so they thought. As the years passed, however, a new problem emerged. Other criminals began copying Cooper's method. His hijacking received enormous media attention across America. Some saw him as a criminal mastermind. Others viewed him as a folk legend. Either way, several hijackers attempted similar operations, and that's when the FBI's assumptions started falling apart. One of the most notable copycats was Martin McNally. In June 1972, only months after Cooper's hijacking, McNally boarded a plane, demanded money, and used a parachute to jump from the aircraft. The similarities were remarkable, but there was one major difference. McNally survived. Even more surprising, he jumped under conditions that were arguably more dangerous than those Cooper faced. Then came another hijacker. Richard LaPointe carried out a similar crime and also parachuted from an aircraft that he survived too. One after another, copycat hijackers proved that escaping from a plane mid-flight wasn't impossible. Most were eventually arrested, but they were alive. This forced investigators to reconsider their original conclusion that if these men could survive their jumps, why couldn't Cooper? The theory became even stronger when witnesses revealed something unusual about Cooper himself. When the parachutes were delivered, instructions were available explaining how to use them. Cooper barely glanced at them. According to witnesses, he appeared to already know exactly what he was doing, and that realization changed everything. Maybe Cooper wasn't an amateur, maybe he had training, maybe this wasn't a desperate gamble at all, maybe the mysterious hijacker had planned every step long before boarding that plane. Now believing that Cooper may have survived, the FBI launched one of the largest search operations in its history. But finding a man who had vanished into miles of wilderness was like searching for a needle in a forest. Fortunately, investigators had one secret advantage: every single dollar Cooper received could be traced. Once investigators began considering the possibility that Cooper had survived, the focus of the case changed dramatically. No longer were they simply searching for a body. Now they were hunting for a living man who had disappeared with $200,000 and somehow vanished without leaving a trace. The challenge was enormous. The Pacific Northwest offered countless places for someone to hide. Dense forests stretched for miles. Rivers, mountains, lakes, and remote wilderness covered the region. Even determining where Cooper had landed proved difficult. Investigators had estimates, but estimates weren't enough. Too many variables were involved. How strong were the winds at the exact moment of the jump? What altitude was Cooper at when he deployed his parachute? Did he drift north or south? Did he land in the forest, near a river, or somewhere completely unexpected? Each possibility created a different search area. Still, the FBI possessed one major advantage: the money. Long before the ransom was handed over, officials had carefully recorded the serial numbers of every bill. The $200,000 wasn't just cash anymore, it was evidence. $10,020 bills, every single one traceable. Investigators distributed the serial number lists across the country. Banks received copies. Casinos received copies. Financial institutions were instructed to report any matching bills immediately. The logic was simple. Sooner or later, Cooper would need to spend the money. And when he did, the FBI would be waiting. At least, that was the plan. Meanwhile, search teams began combing through the wilderness. The day after the hijacking, officers, volunteers, and specialists entered the suspected drop zone. They searched forests, valleys, and remote terrain looking for anything connected to the hijacker. A body. A parachute. A bag. A single $20 bill. Anything, but nothing appeared. As months turned into years, investigators expanded their efforts. Using weather data, flight records, and witness testimony, they estimated that Cooper may have landed somewhere near the Lake Merwin area in Washington state. To improve their calculations, the FBI conducted unusual experiments. They flew aircraft under conditions similar to those on the night of the hijacking. During one test, they pushed a heavy sled from the rear staircase of a Boeing 727 to study how objects would behave after leaving the aircraft. The goal was to better understand where Cooper might have landed. The results helped narrow the search area, but not enough to solve the mystery. Authorities then launched extensive ground operations. Teams visited local farms. They knocked on doors. Residents were questioned repeatedly. Investigators searched roads, fields, and wooded areas. Even lakes became targets. Boats patrolled the water. Divers joined the effort. Private companies offered assistance. One company even provided a submarine capable of exploring deep sections beneath the surface. Yet despite all these resources, the result remained the same. Nothing. No parachute. No money. Nobody. Not a single confirmed clue. Years passed. Then 8 years after the hijacking, a development occurred that would completely reshape the investigation. It came from an unexpected source. Not an FBI agent. Not a detective. Not a witness. But a young boy playing near a riverbank. And what he uncovered would provide the first major breakthrough in the entire case. For nearly a decade, the money had remained invisible. Not one confirmed bill had surfaced anywhere in America. Then, in 1980, a child digging beside a river made a discovery so shocking that it instantly revived the entire investigation, and raised even more questions than it answered. For nearly 8 years, the FBI's strategy seemed straightforward. If Cooper had survived, eventually some of the ransom money would appear somewhere in the economy. Perhaps he would spend it at a casino. Perhaps he would deposit it into a bank. Perhaps a store clerk would notice a serial number matching the FBI's records. Yet year after year, nothing happened. Not a single verified bill surfaced. The money had seemingly vanished along with Cooper. As time passed, many investigators began to lose hope. The case remained open, but progress was painfully slow. Then, in 1979, an unexpected development breathed new life into the investigation. A commercial pilot named Tom Bohan contacted the FBI. Unlike most people offering theories, Bohan had a unique perspective. On the night of the hijacking, he had actually been flying in the same region. His aircraft was reportedly traveling several minutes behind Cooper's plane and at a higher altitude. Years later, Bohan recalled the severe weather conditions that night. The storm, he claimed, was one of the worst he had ever encountered during his flying career. After reviewing the FBI's assumptions, he reached a surprising conclusion. He believed investigators had been searching in the wrong area. According to Bohan, weather conditions may have pushed Cooper much farther than originally estimated. He suggested that authorities should focus their attention near the drainage system connected to the Washougal River. At first, it was simply another theory. But only months later, something remarkable happened. A young boy was spending time along the banks of the Columbia River when he noticed something unusual buried in the sand. Curious, he began digging. What he uncovered looked like old, decaying bundles of cash. The bills were badly damaged after years of exposure to water and the elements, but there was enough remaining for investigators to examine them. When authorities checked the serial numbers, the result was immediate. The money matched the ransom given to Cooper. For the first time since the hijacking, investigators had recovered physical evidence directly connected to the crime. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Reporters rushed to cover the story. Experts revisited old theories. The public became fascinated once again. But there was a problem. The breakthrough answered one question while creating several new ones. Only a small portion of the ransom had been found. Roughly $5,800 out of the original $200,000. Where was the rest? How had those bundles reached the riverbank? Had Cooper buried them? Had floodwaters carried them there, or did the money arrive after some event involving Cooper himself? No one knew. The FBI launched another large-scale search around the area. Investigators hoped to find additional bills, pieces of a parachute, clothing, equipment, or even human remains. But despite extensive efforts, nothing else significant was discovered. The river had provided a clue, not a solution. The mystery remained alive. And while investigators debated how the money reached the Columbia River, another team of researchers would later examine one forgotten item left on the plane, a simple tie. What they discovered decades later would offer one of the most fascinating clues about who Cooper might have been. The tie Cooper left behind appeared ordinary at first glance. But when modern scientists examined microscopic particles hidden within its fibers, they uncovered evidence that suggested Cooper may have worked in a highly specialized industry, possibly one connected to the very aircraft he hijacked. The discovery of Cooper's ransom money near the Columbia River reignited public interest in the case. For a brief moment, many people believed the mystery was finally about to be solved. But despite renewed searches and fresh investigations, the FBI still faced the same problem they had struggled with since 1971. They had evidence. They had theories. But they still didn't know who Cooper actually was. As years passed, investigators turned their attention back to the few items Cooper had left behind aboard the aircraft. Among them was a black clip-on tie and a tie clip. At first, these items appeared almost useless. But advances in forensic science would eventually transform them into one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. In 2009, a group of researchers decided to re-examine the tie using modern technology that hadn't existed during the original investigation. The team included experts from different scientific fields. Using powerful electron microscopes, they searched for microscopic traces hidden within the fabric. What they found was unexpected. Tiny particles of rare industrial materials were embedded in the tie. Among them were traces of pure titanium, aluminum compounds, and titanium antimony alloys. To most people, these findings meant nothing. To specialists, however, they suggested something very interesting. During the early 1970s, these materials were commonly associated with aerospace manufacturing, chemical production, and advanced engineering industries. In simple terms, Cooper may have worked in an environment where such materials were regularly present. This discovery fueled a new theory. Perhaps Cooper wasn't just an ordinary criminal, perhaps he had a technical background. Maybe he worked for an aviation company. Maybe he had access to aircraft facilities. Some researchers even speculated that he could have worked for an organization connected to Boeing, the same company that manufactured the Boeing 727 he hijacked. While this theory couldn't prove Cooper's identity, it strengthened the belief that he possessed specialized knowledge. And that knowledge wasn't limited to materials alone. Remember, Cooper knew exactly how to operate around the aircraft. He understood the significance of the rear staircase. He selected flight conditions that suited his escape plan. He appeared familiar with parachutes. These weren't necessarily things an average passenger would know. Meanwhile, investigators continued another crucial task. They tried to determine what Cooper actually looked like. In the days following the hijacking, witnesses worked with artists to create facial sketches. The first sketch was released only a few days after the crime. But many witnesses felt it wasn't accurate. A second version followed. Again, concerns remained. Finally, after additional interviews and refinements, the FBI released a third and final composite sketch. This version received much stronger support from crew members who had spent hours observing Cooper. For the first time, the public had what investigators believed was the closest representation of the mysterious hijacker. Newspapers published the sketch. Television programs discussed it. Thousands of tips flooded into FBI offices. People from across the country claimed they recognized the face. The problem? Many of those tips pointed to different individuals. Soon, investigators found themselves drowning in possibilities. Over the years, hundreds upon hundreds of names were submitted. Some were quickly dismissed. Others seemed surprisingly convincing. Eventually, more than 800 potential suspects entered FBI records. Out of those hundreds, only a small number attracted serious attention. And among them was one man whose story seemed almost too similar to Cooper's to ignore. His name was Richard McCoy. And many people believed the mystery had finally been solved. 5 months after Cooper's disappearance, Richard McCoy carried out a hijacking that looked almost identical to the original crime. He demanded cash, requested parachutes, escaped through the rear staircase of a Boeing 727, and jumped into the darkness. The similarities were so striking that some investigators became convinced they were chasing the same man. By the time investigators narrowed their massive suspect list, one name stood above the rest: Richard McCoy. At first glance, the similarities between McCoy and Cooper were almost unbelievable. In April 1972, only 5 months after the famous hijacking, McCoy boarded a Boeing 727 and carried out a crime that looked remarkably familiar. He demanded a large ransom, requested multiple parachutes, and after receiving the money, escaped through the aircraft's rear staircase while the plane was still in flight. The parallels were impossible to ignore. To many observers, it looked like a repeat performance. Some investigators even began to suspect that the man known as D.B. Cooper had simply returned for another attempt. The theory gained even more attention years later when a book titled D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy argued that McCoy and Cooper were the same person. According to the authors, several pieces of evidence pointed toward McCoy's involvement. But there was a major problem. The FBI wasn't convinced. When agents compared witness descriptions and official sketches with McCoy's appearance, significant differences emerged. More importantly, investigators later found evidence suggesting McCoy was elsewhere during the night of Cooper's hijacking. Records placed him in Las Vegas. The following day, he was reportedly with his family. If those records were accurate, then McCoy simply could not have been Cooper. Despite the striking similarities between the crimes, the FBI eventually moved away from him as a primary suspect. Yet the search continued. Another intriguing candidate soon emerged. His name was Robert Rackstraw. A Vietnam War veteran, Rackstraw had a history that immediately caught investigators' attention. Over the years, he had been linked to fraud, aircraft-related crimes, and explosives offenses. Supporters of the theory argued that he possessed many of the skills Cooper would have needed. Even more interestingly, some people believed his appearance resembled the FBI sketches. Decades later, television producer Thomas Colbert launched his own investigation into the case. Working alongside researchers and former law enforcement personnel, he publicly argued that Rackstraw was the real Cooper. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. The theory gained international attention. Yet once again, the evidence fell short. While Rackstraw remained one of the most discussed suspects, authorities never obtained enough proof to officially identify him as the hijacker. And so the investigation reached the same frustrating conclusion it had reached countless times before. A promising lead. A fascinating theory. No definitive answer. Then, in July 2016, after 45 years of investigation, thousands of interviews, hundreds of suspects, and one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history, the agency made a historic announcement. The case was officially closed. Not solved. Closed. Even today, nobody knows for certain who the man calling himself Dan Cooper really was. Nobody knows where he came from. Nobody knows whether he survived the jump. Nobody knows what happened to the remaining ransom money. And perhaps that's why this story continues to fascinate people more than half a century later. Because unlike most mysteries, this one never provided a final chapter. A man boarded a plane as an ordinary passenger. Hours later, he vanished into a stormy night carrying a fortune. And somehow, against all odds, he was never seen again. The world remembers him as D.B. Cooper. But the truth is that the real identity behind that name may remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries forever. What do you think happened on that cold November night? Did Cooper survive the jump and quietly disappear into a new life? Did he perish somewhere in the wilderness before anyone could find him? Or is there another explanation that investigators never considered? Whatever the answer may be, one fact remains unchanged. More than 50 years later, the legend of D.B. Cooper continues to challenge investigators, inspire theories, and captivate curious minds around the world.